Hello, listeners, Dutch listeners and international listeners. My name is John Consemulder. I'm speaking in English terms here. Well, at least I'm trying. So please forgive me if I sound too Dutch for you international listeners. But I have two very, let's say heavyweights in consciousness. And to be very humble here, and they are listening, I know, so that's a good thing. I feel absolutely honored to have them here in this radio show because they're heavyweights in their research on near-death experiences and intention and conscious work. And the two guests are Raymond Moody and William Tiller, or Bill Tiller, I believe I can also call him, but I'll hear from that later. And I think it's interesting because we have a show where we might be discussing consciousness in its broadest term, because consciousness and intention, we can look at it right now as something involved in life processes and maybe process before life or in other lives and even after death, so in the near-death experience. I can do a general introduction, but I think you have seen in the texts what these heavyweights have been doing for writing and in research. So they're already waiting, so please let me introduce both of the guests tonight. Mr. Raymond Moody, are you there?
Yes, sir. How are you today? Thank you so much for having me on the program.
You're more than welcome. To answer your question how I'm doing today, a bit nervous, but you'll probably understand why. I think it's an absolute honor to have you in the show. Okay, dear listeners, we're back here live in the program with at least a connection to Bill Tiller live. Let's check if that's right before I'm talking to my other personality here. Bill, are you still on the line?
I am still on the line and ready to go.
Welcome to the show. So Raymond will probably get in a minute. What I think is special about your work, we met personally at the RAI conference where we interviewed with Dr. Eric Pearl and Lynn McTaggart. We didn't have the time to speak very long, and now we do. And I think that's very nice because I think your work is amazing regarding intention and consciousness experiments and actually proving that intention works and influences reality. And I wrote down something you said at that conference. Consciousness manipulates information and information has meaning. I thought that was amazing. In my book Blueprint, I write about what I call real reality of sound, light, and energy, and interference patterns and standing waves, and relating to consciousness. But I think what's so amazing in your research is that you're actually proving that thoughts and focused intentions can influence what I call the 0-point energy spheres of the environment, so you can create sacred space to intention. And I have some questions. I think that would be a good way to start.
All right. Let me add one thing to what you said,
good.
Because it's clear from our research that it's possible to change the properties of materials through consciousness. So it isn't just changing the state of reality in a room, which could be subjective, but we are able to measure thermodynamically that change with a probe. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, in matter itself, not just a 0-point energy as like a background radiation source, but actually what we call matter. You influence, because that's amazing. You did an intention experiment where you focused on an intention on electronic device with, I believe, some oscillators and some electronic stuff in there, which actually can hold the intention as like a captured intention, which you send to. Yeah, the host, and you send it to a different location. And I thought the nice thing was that you wrap that host around with an intention to have as less possible leakage, so to speak. And that host gets to another location where, if it's close enough to like the pH of something or an enzyme, it changes these fundamental aspects. So I have a summary here of your experiments. One is an intention to raise or decrease the pH of water by 1 pH unit. So either increase or decrease the H plus content of this water by a factor of 10. And the result was up to 1 pH. And I believe if you have a half pH, you could already be dead in a physical life. So that's quite an achievement. Unit increase and decrease of water samples was achieved. And the other experiment I'll mention here was in vivo fruit fly studies, where the intention was to influence the availability of nutrients and enzymes in fruit fly larvae, resulting in significantly reduced development time relative to that of an unimprinted control device. So that's very important from a scientific sense, a control device which is not being imprinted. And the result was a 15% reduction in larval development time for those exposed to imprinted device versus the control group of larvae. And the other one is an in vitro enzyme studies, also very fascinating. The intention was to influence a device so as to increase the thermodynamic activity of a liver enzyme, alkaline phosphatase, I believe. And the result was 10 to 20% increase in the thermodynamic activity of ALP of those samples exposed to imprinted device versus the control group exposed to unimprinted device.
So exposed only for 30 minutes to that.
Exposed only for 30 minutes. Okay. So this is actually because I've read your 3 books. I don't have the last one, but I have I've read Science and Human Transformation and Conscious Acts of Creation, and I'm working on Adventures with Real Magic, but that title I like to stick with that because these are real scientific confirmations and adventures working with real magic. In a way, it's not magic anymore. Now it's science because the magic is the
magic, of course, is the word you use when you don't understand what is causing it to happen, but it's just physics, but physics beyond the orthodox physics we deal with every day.
True.
Okay, and I want, if I may,
of course,
I would like to go back. I have a beef, and the beef is that people use the word 0 point energy to express much more than they think. The dilemma is that 0 point energy has been known since the 1930s, and it's defined as the energy associated with electromagnetic vibrations at absolute zero of temperature. Mm-hmm. And that was a quantum mechanical calculation. But it's dealing with electromagnetic energy, whereas the huge host of energy is the physical vacuum, which is beyond electromagnetic. Sure. In fact, it is that which is stored in the vacuum is beyond imagining compared to all the electromagnetic energy in our planets and stars and cosmic dust. That is trivial compared to the energy stored in the physical vacuum. Mm-hmm. And the physical vacuum means the absence of electric atom molecule stuff. Okay, I mean the distinction is when people use this word 0 point energy to mean everything. The vacuum stuff as well as the electric atom molecule stuff. And if we don't get it straight early on, it's going to be a terribly confusing thing as we go deeper and deeper into the research of the physical vacuum.
Well, very good thing to add, because immediately comes to mind the work of Tom Bearden and scalar electromagnetics, and he also points out that it's not 0 point energy, it's energy from the vacuum, which has a pre-conditioned state where it doesn't have the interaction with matter, which changes everything. And actually, that's... Yes, yeah?
Well, I want to add, there's a very nice calculation you can do. You can calculate all the energy, the electromagnetic energy stored in the electric atom molecule world in a sphere of a radius of 15 billion light years. So you're talking about adding up all the energy associated with the matter we can detect in planets and stars and cosmic dust. And you can say, okay, let's hold that in our right hand. On the other hand, you can take in your left hand the volume of a single hydrogen atom and multiply it by the calculated energy density of the physical vacuum, calculated by really very, very good physicists, that has to be there in order for our present quantum mechanics and relativity theory to be internally self-consistent. You have another number. That number in the left hand is 1 trillion times the number in your right hand. It's immense. The physical vacuum, which of course is the area where all the phenomena you want to talk to Raymond about and about myself, is all stuff that's in the physical vacuum. So that is a huge area that we need to come to understand, because it is where humanity's future will be based on.
Can we call that the ether, or what the ancients called the quintessence?
Well, the ether, I think, is one level of that. The old ether. It's what it's the energy structures from the coarsest level of the physical vacuum. So I call it magneto-electric energy. But basically, these are words we need to live with for a while to understand their difference from other things. The vacuum, in my view, is very structured. There's many, many levels of reality, and they're all non-physical. We have to develop new measuring instruments to access them. It's a different. They function in the universe. It's almost like the multiverse aspect. If I just take the electric atom molecule world under normal reality conditions, it is isolated from the magnetic information wave world, which is at the coarsest level of the physical vacuum. And it's because all the substance of the vacuum go faster than the velocity of light, the velocity of electromagnetic light. And therefore, they cannot directly interact with each other because they have to reach across the electromagnetic light barrier, and relativity theory says that can't happen. However, if you can have a coupling medium from a higher dimensional level of reality, which can be manipulated by human consciousness, then you can interact across that light barrier. And that's what my research deals with.
Is this exactly what you call the coupled state? Because it sounds as if you...
Yes.
Yes, because you have to couple. Because that was one of my main questions. I'll ask you right now. Because what I thought was fascinating was this conditioning of rooms, even non-locally. I call it sacred space when we create
I agree.
Sound healing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, but what gets conditioned? Because the cool thing is I do not want a new world order the way the most politicians want, but the way you're talking actually is exactly the ordering we would like to want, because you're proving that with pure focused intentions we can non-locally order, structure, and receive coherence through frequency vibrations and resonance into matter and into space, creating sacred space. But more important, what I found out in your work, it creates like an amplification effect through entanglement and through coupled states, which I think is the main point here, which leaves a residue, like Garyaev calls maybe the phantom DNA effect, because it sounded like that in my ears.
Yes.
But it leaves a residue which actually has a resonance and an amplification effect. So an intention can become like the butterfly effect, right?
Well, in a sense, those are buzzwords, though, too. So you have to be very careful.
Yes, true.
The coupled. See, our work indicates, at least at the simplest level, that there are two uniquely different levels of physical reality. One, which travels slower than the velocity of light, that's the electric atom molecule world. And one which goes faster than the velocity of light, and that's the magnetic information wave level of the vacuum. And that is where the pilot wave from de Broglie particle pilot wave comes from. And I don't mean the group wave that is around the particle. It is, which goes at the same velocity as the particle, but it is the wave that generates that group wave. And it goes faster than light, and it's been calculated that so long as you take relativity and simple quantum mechanics together, you can calculate the relationship between these things. Interestingly enough, it was done in a book by the man by the name of Iceberg in 1961, and orthodox physics seems to have neglected its presence totally, which is very surprising to me. But in any event, that is the issue, and this is the kind of thing that we must come to deal with. And so there is a need for a coupler in order to make these two levels of reality function together. And when they are coupled, we find that consciousness can influence the magnetic information wave level and change the properties of that level. And so that the property of a material, specific material, is made of two parts. It's made of the electric part plus a coupling coefficient times the property of the other part. And that coupling coefficient can be such as to increase the magnitude of the material property or decrease the magnitude of the material property. So that's the reality which it seems to me we are moving towards as a species, and it's human consciousness that brings about that connection. We've done it in the laboratory many, 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 many times. Mm-hmm. And we have had replication of the pH work in other laboratories and published paper on that kind of thing. So it is a reality, but the problem is it's terribly confusing for orthodox science. And here's the basis of why there is that confusion, why the difficulty. Orthodox science seeks internal self-consistency relative to a reference frame for viewing nature. And the reference frame we've had for the last 400 years is exclusively distance and time. Mm-hmm. But this category of phenomena in nature, there are categories that have, let's say, properties that are not distance dependent or not strongly time dependent. In quantum mechanics, that, for example, is an equation, Schrodinger wave equation, which is crucial in that it is a distance-time equation. And so long as you're dealing with the phenomena that are distance and time dependent, as we do with the four fundamental forces we know, gravity, mm-hmm. electromagnetism, short-range nuclear force, long-range nuclear force, then all of those forces can be dealt with. And you can build science and technology, and it's wonderful in a way. But there's a whole class of phenomena that have been swept under the rug because they're not internally self-consistent with that reference frame. And because they exist, orthodox scientists like to sweep them under the rug, like to ignore them, or say that it's charlatanism, it's all of these quackery, all of these kinds of things. And they haven't tumbled to the fact that nature, the phenomena of nature, are not just distance and time dependent. They're dependent on some other frame of reference, some other way of looking at nature. You know, you have to have a frame of reference to look at natural phenomena in order to make sense and order of them. And that's this internal self-consistency picture. In a simple sense, if you go back to the days of Galileo, the priest of that time would not look through his telescope to look at nature that he was revealing with that instrument. And they did that because they had developed the theocratic state that they've lived with for such a long time that they had hubris, which is always develops when you've been in power a long time. The hubris was that they knew the answer. They believed they really knew the answer. They didn't have to look at the telescope. It had to be wrong because it was not internally self-consistent with the theocratic predictions. Well, of course, they were wrong. And that's what's happening today. Orthodox scientists They mean well, but they have a lot of power, and therefore they have a lot of hubris. And they can't imagine that nature has characteristics beyond spatial and temporal characteristics, because they've played with those things for 400 years. It's a very natural thing, but orthodox sciences and universities are terribly stuck. They're stuck in a space-time only frame of reference for nature. And the work that I've been doing and talking about is dealing with phenomena that are outside of space and time.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I think is interesting, because I've always said as a scientist, if your scientific model doesn't take care of what you might call anomalies, what they call the charlatan work, but it's only charlatan if you don't believe it's true. And I believe either you or Raymond said something beautiful at the conference. I believe it was Raymond Moody saying some things are the case no matter what people think of them. And Dr. Arapil referred, I want that on a t-shirt. Well, I thought that was a good one, because if the model doesn't cover that anomaly, then the model representing reality does not represent reality in its essence, because otherwise the anomaly wouldn't be there. Yes.
I think the issue is that, the purity of science is supposed to be that if you see something that is remarkably anomalous and it cannot be addressed with your frame of reference, you are really required to pursue looking at it and trying to understand it, and be willing to change your frame of reference, because it is nature. It just is. And basically, Raymond's work, which is quite wonderful, it deals with a phenomenon which is functioning in the structure of the physical vacuum that I talk about, and which cannot be dealt with orthodox science, because it's outside of space and time.
And what I think is also fascinating is not just an interesting or fascinating near-death experience. No, it reflects on very deep insights about life in general, in the now, which does your work. So that's what I thought was fascinating to try to combine. You're saying under at least some conditions, human intention acts like a typical potential capable of creating robust effects, and they are. As a scientist, I've seen that they are, and they're. You can study them, but you can also verify them, and they have been verified by other research and other scientists independently. So that's a good thing.
Well, one of them has the replication has only worked, has only been tried. For the water pH, because that's the cheapest one and the easiest one to investigate.
No, but that on a broader sense, it says that intention work is a pure thing we can verify. So it's the other things haven't been proven from other laboratories perhaps, but it's a good sign that intention actually works in the physical reality. So you're saying it's capable of creating robust effects in what we call physical reality. This significantly broadens the purview of physics, challenges its present perspectives, like we just talked about, the mindsets and laws, and sets it on a new course toward understanding how physical matter and energy are connected to human consciousness. And I think that's an important statement, because... And
I want to insert, it helps us understand ourself, our humanness.
True.
That's really crucial in this whole issue.
Yeah, because you're also saying human consciousness is the byproduct of higher dimensional spiritual energies entering dense matter. I love that one, because as a neuropsychologist, I know that most neuropsychologists would say human consciousness is the byproduct of brain activity. And then I think, well, talk to Tiller, but especially talk to Raymond Moody as well, because if the brain doesn't function, but you still have perceptions and memories, and even can describe what happened to you while you were actually crossing over to another dimension, actually dying, it's not the brain that does the work.
No, let me go, if I may, still enter here and point to the work by Tor Nørretrander from Denmark, which is now available in English, fortunately. And he brought up the point that the information handling capacity of the unconscious, the human unconscious, is about 1 million times greater than that of the conscious. And because the conscious information handling capacity appears to be less than 50 bits per second. Now, just at the 5 physical senses level, that is. And so what he proposed from his work is that it is the human unconscious that gathers the information from nature, probably manipulates it in various ways with mathematics and algorithms and so on, and then it constructs little kernels of information which it feeds to the conscious brain so the conscious brain can experience this classroom we're in. And the interesting thing beyond that is that the kernels have a content only of the type that the conscious brain has heretofore given meaning. If the conscious brain does not give meaning to a set of phenomena or things in life, in nature, let's call it that way, then the unconscious knows there's no point in delivering that kind of information. So it restricts itself to stuff that humans have already given meaning to.
Like the filtration theory.
And the rest of it seems to be dumped. It may not be, but it may be. It certainly seems to be excluded. So the whole business of dealing with consciousness and afterlife experiences and pre-death experiences, these relate to what you give meaning to, because we're talking about the human conscious experiencing it. And so that's a very key issue in the observation of Raymond's work. And so I'm saying, you see, you have to have then this structure within the vacuum, various levels, the magnetic information wave level, the emotion domain level, the mind domain level, spirit, and the way I view the whole person is that the whole person is, I think of a sphere, and there are 3 zones. The outermost zone is made of 2 layers of material. One is the electric atom molecule. The second is the magnetic information wave. It goes faster than light because it's in the vacuum. That I call a personality self. It has a relatively short lifetime compared to the middle zone, which is made from the emotion domain stuff, the mind domain stuff, and some aspect of the spirit domain stuff. And that's the soul self. So, and then the core is, I think of as the high spirit self, the source self or God self, whichever word you want to use. But let's go back to this business of Raymond's study. If you are having a near-death experience, you have to, the unconscious must take the information from the magnetic information wave or below, okay, into from the soul self, that aspect, and then push kernels of that information to the human conscious in order to have a near-death experience. So these energy levels, these bands of energies of different kinds, are existing in the vacuum, and there has to be a transformation of information process between those and the second layer of the personality self, that is the inner layer, because that's where the unconscious functions, and it has this huge handling capacity of information. So that whole thing connects with what Raymond is studying and my work. And I'm glad you invited us both to be on at the same time, because I really started to think about what it meant in relationship to my stuff. And I think it's very interesting.
Well, that's exactly the point. I thought, well, if there's life in life now, and there's life probably after life, which the near-death experience shows us, not in a replicable sense by experimental science, but at least a very convincing science showing a coherent picture that the interconnectedness and the loving feelings and the beautiful music and the beautiful experience and the people who come back change their life. They have this transformation. And I know your work is focusing. You have one book called Science and Human Transformation.
Exactly.
And you're even saying there might be a time we might become like at the level of avatars, like a Christ or a Buddha. And I have a question about that because I actually believe that it's true. And as spiritual human beings we are, which is I think is a very hyped term as well, but we are ascending in a way. But we are the ones we've been waiting for. We have to actively do the intention work and do it the right way this time. But you're saying that we can reach the level of avatars, but you're also saying, which I thought was interesting, that evolution in a way protects us, perhaps, because it was a suggestion, from doing real harm, so that the power of attention has like a protection zone so we don't harm each other too much. But at the same time, I'm thinking, hey, doesn't that reduce the power of intention? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's a complex picture. All right, our experiments show that in a human and probably in all vertebrates, the acupuncture meridian system is already at the coupled level of physical reality.
Oh, you talked about it in the lecture, I remember, yes.
Yes, and that's crucial because it says we all have within us the latent infrastructure. It's born into us, and it's there throughout our life. And we can choose to develop that, to really consciously work with it. At the moment, from the neurotranda work, it indicates that we are mostly very unconscious beings. And so, but it also shows the latent capability that we can develop as we work on ourselves, build more infrastructure into ourselves. So that because the acupuncture meridian system is on the one side, it's connected to the chakras, so the higher dimensional levels of self. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, it's connected to the electric atom molecule world. So, in essence, unconsciously, people move chi, okay, which is really the magneto-electric stuff at the coarsest level of vacuum. The acupuncture meridian system functions in that inner layer of the personality self, the faster than light layer, and so at least that's my working hypothesis, and so if an individual really realizes the capability of that system, and they start working on themselves like on an inner gym, instead of at the moment people, or in addition to going out to gyms and exercising and becoming buff and all of that, to work on the inside, to work on the infrastructure, building it within, then more spirit can enter. It appears that spirit needs infrastructure to attach to. Again, that's another working hypothesis. And as more spirit enters, you become more conscious. You begin to perceive things that you didn't before. And of course, you give more things meaning, and so your unconscious feeds you more information of this type. Mm-hmm. So it's a bootstrap process in which we can go. Now, we are able to measure the change in the what's called the electromagnetic gauge symmetry state of a space when we're going from an uncoupled state to a coupled state. And because we're able to measure that quantitatively, then we have the chance of building a biofeedback device that an individual could use and they could practice with it so that they could they increase their ability to intend. And as they do that, they will change from a normal individual to an adept. And if they keep practicing, they will change from an adept to a master. just like a Qigong master.
Yes, sir.
And if they keep going, then they will become an avatar. This capability appears to be within every one of us if we desire it enough and we're willing to make the effort to build oneself. And that, I think, is the future for humankind as we move out of this epoch that we've had for millennia, which has been a very unconscious epoch. We've been, we're not very coherent. Towards the next epoch, where we will be much more coherent, and then the ones beyond that, as we return home to total coherence with the all.
Yeah, and then we can really create conscious acts of creation.
Absolutely.
That's
well, we can do it. We can do it in small ways now. I mean, the capability is there for us to do it. Our experiments show that we can change the properties of materials, and people do it. People create a mood in a space. You can walk into some people's homes, and it feels so welcoming and so warm and vibrant. In other people's homes, it doesn't feel like that at all. So we are unconsciously doing these kinds of things. And what I'm saying is, from our research, we should start doing it consciously. And building.
But there is a thing I want to add, which automatically leads to a question, because what I think is fascinating, in a way, if we become more conscious of consciousness and are being actors in this creation part with intention and focused work, there comes responsibility. And what I'm thinking here we go, the free will and responsibility part. And like I said to Lynn McTaggart, if you and also to Roger Nelson with his Global Consciousness Project, which you probably know, you have constructive interference where you get amplification and resonance, but you also have destructive interference, and then you can level out to zero. But I say no, this zero, this noise is information, but it's only being leveled out because of two waves, making a zero signal in your science and measurement. But if you transfer that thought of destructive interference in human potential, then here it comes, of course, if we can focus on good intentions and we want to heal the world, let's and heal ourselves. What about all the intentions for a better world which get pulled back or cancelled out or attenuated because of all the negative thoughts? And do we have to find the people with the bad intentions? Do we have to call them on their responsibility to heal the world, or do we accept free will? So I saw a thing which has to be implemented the right way to have coherence in the world.
Right. Well, let me address that, because it's a very important issue, and there are two things that I want to talk about. One is, let's take a simple incandescent light bulb. All right, 60 watts. Say it gives a bit of light, but not a lot of light, because the electromagnetic photons are destructively interfering with each other as they come out of the light bulb. Now, suppose you could influence those photons to come out riding on each other's back so that you have constructive interference. In that case, the energy density coming out of that light bulb would probably be 10 times the surface of the sun. So the issue is, that is the potential that is available in that 60-watt light bulb. Now, we know that when you move to an LED, light-emitting diode, pushed beyond its coherence threshold, then you can get a laser. And we now know that automobile companies are bundling a bunch of LEDs to make the taillights on cars. So it's already coming into use in that way.
Sure.
So that's important. The second thing, I think, so there we see the potential. And that potential in the light bulb is exactly like the potential that's in the human that I'm talking about. All right? Now, the stumbling block for most humans is their personal ego. Now, ego is important in so many things, to be able to really desire something and make it happen. The issue is not to give up the ego, but it is to put it in service to the larger whole, because we are a larger whole We are a multi-located organism, and the more conscious we become, the more we move towards this coupled state of physical reality. We become linked with everything, and we will see how much we are connected to everyone and to everything. And that requires that we put our efforts towards serving the larger whole. It is a state of mind transition. We humans, I think, have come to that step in the scheme of development, where we must address that. And it doesn't take anything away to put one's ego in service to the larger whole. In fact, one grows, and one grows in awareness, and one grows and grows and grows, and has energy and information capabilities beyond our imagination, accessible to us when we do that. So the information is out there in the universe. So the issue is to learn how to access it. And you access it if you're willing to serve the larger whole. And that's what happens on your pathway to becoming an avatar.
That's an important one. The willingness to put the ego aside to become, because the connection is always there.
Don't give up the ego, but just put it to service of the larger whole.
Yes. Because you don't want to lose your power and your opinions, and because that's logical. But use it to connect, because that's my thought, that this vacuum state is a holographic and multidimensional layered world, and we can connect to everything because the portals are already there. But we have to activate them with the willingness to put the ego to work to connect to all these levels, which are interconnected anyway. And the nice thing is that the work of Raymond, and I hope, by the way, that technician can get a hold of him also again, that near-death experience, because that's what I want to tell the listeners, and I hope you will affirm that we don't have to do that by dying, because if we die, we get these experiences, well, at least the near-death experiences, experience those feelings, which we can handle and implement in life. I call it the near-life experience, so to have a better life.
Right, I mean, those are good words, and it's like a fluctuation in information states, if you want to use a quantum mechanical analogy or even classical mechanical analogy. We, in order for a diffusion process of one chemical through a medium of another, you have to have a thermal fluctuation big enough to get over the activation barrier and to move that atom from place to place. And so the issue is one has to realize that in any, let's say, an energy ensemble, if you put molecules in a box, all right, the box has a certain temperature, and the simplistic assumption assumes is that every one of those molecules is at the same temperature, but that is not true at all. It has its energy content. It is part of a statistical system in which there is a natural distribution of energies, very few at low energy, very few at very high energy. Most of them in the mean, a kind of a mean. So if you plot number versus energy, you see a curve that starts down near zero, and then it climbs to a maximum, and then goes out to a long tail. Now you can take the same kind. So the issue is each one of those molecules has a different energy content, but statistically, they give an average energy content which determines what the temperature is of the box. So it's the statistical interaction that's important, because it's the ensemble that's important, the collective. Now, you take the analogy to a human, and now we would look at number versus consciousness. The same kind of plot, very few at low consciousness, goes up to a maximum and then goes down and out to a long tail. The avatars are way out there at the long tail, at very, very high levels of consciousness. But the difference between us and molecules is we have free will. We can make the choice to move up the domain of consciousness or down the domain of consciousness, etc. So that is important in the distinction of things. Now, there's another feature which is really important. If we go back to the molecules, it appears that over time, if you sample the system, every individual molecule samples through all the states, the energy states of the ensemble. And if you deal with electrons in a metal or a semiconductor or such, they do the same kind of thing. Now, in humans, I would propose that we need to do the same kind of thing, that is to really sample all these states of consciousness in the ensemble. But you can't do that over in just one lifetime, because what humans seem to do is they eventually evolve to a place where they orbit around a certain domain of consciousness. And so they only sample a small region in a particular lifetime of consciousness. And that, to me, says, okay, this is why re-embodiment, reincarnation, whatever words you want to use, is necessary for the humanity ensemble to become complete in its function as a living system with free will. So it's a very interesting thing, and of course within that concept is the issue of the near death. I mean, to me, we're indestructible. The thing that has a huge lifetime is the soul self. That's what's really evolving. And
infinite consciousness.
Yeah, and the personality self is the vehicle that's needed for us to experience this classroom, because the personality self, over eons and eons of time, developed the 5 physical senses in the organism that we took as, well, I would suggest that it was inhabited by a soul self and eventually has evolved in a cooperative way to its present state. In our case, ape or chimpanzee or whatever relative on this planet seem to be that organism. Again, all part of the evolutionary process. So, very interesting as far as I can see, and I think it ties in very much with the sorts of things that Raymond has pursued in his studies.
Well, you're reading my thoughts here, because we're taking a break. But before we do that, in the talk where I was listening, you said you are more complex than a light bulb. You were talking about a light bulb.
Yes.
So you are more complex than a light bulb, but hey, you can do a lot more. Okay, so that sums that story up, and also makes the connection with the NDE work of Raymond Moody.
By chance, they have a near-death experience. They will come back with an entirely new type of reason to be able to relate the experience to the rest of us.
Yes, well, I think that's very important, and as I was talking to John before, most of the experience we've had is distance-time experience, whereas a near-death experience, in order to bring that into the whole, there has to be an expansion of the reference frame for viewing nature.
Well,
beyond
absolutely,
just
because
distance and time.
Yes, because people who have such experiences say that it's not in the framework of time and space as we now appreciate it.
I agree.
In the meantime, to the both of you, we are back on air, but I thought unless you are going to tell us something very private, we cut it down. But this was also a good start. So to the listeners, we are now together in this interconnected universe. So the hologram is complete. We are with Raymond Moody and Bill Tiller, and I'm your host, John Consemulder. And to introduce Mr. Raymond Moody's work, how can I do that? Because then we need 2 weeks' work as well as with Bill Tiller. But what I found out, and maybe Raymond, you can reflect to that, what I thought was interesting when I did some research this week about the near-death experience, some more research I have to say, I found out it relates to, and also Bill Tiller's work with consciousness and intention does, to lucid dreams, to the out-of-body experience, to beings of light, to other worlds and dimensions, the multidimensional world, the holographic universe, non-local information transfer, the alternate consciousness paradigm, parapsychology and ESP, spirituality, religion, the cosmic universe, trance states, shamanism, occultism, magic, love, oneness and interconnectedness, meditation, transcendental meditation, healing, telepathy, your higher self, the soul, infinity, immortality, and all of creation. So what I found out, that the near-death experience, sounds good, huh? The near-death experience is more related to life than death itself.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, one of the most common things that people tell me when they come back from a close call with death is that far from being an obliteration of consciousness, the state they entered into when they almost died was more real than real. They say that...
more alive.
Yes, more alive than real, than ordinary life. I've heard many people say, in effect, that they have never felt more alive than when the doctor said that they were dead.
Yeah. Well, that would suggest that they were really conscious of the unconscious.
Well, yes, and also that this is perhaps a whole new dimension or level of consciousness that,
right.
You know, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher of the 18th century, was famous for saying that the afterlife question is not going to be solved by the logic that we have, that it requires an entirely new set of logical principles and perhaps even new faculties of the mind that will enable us to comprehend those principles. And although in the past this has been regarded as an impossible dream, that people say that Hume's criterion can't be met, I absolutely assert that it can be met, and that
I agree.
I am really willing to issue that challenge now, and to say that over the last 40 years I have gradually put together a method for imparting a new system of logic that enables us to move very far forward in the rational comprehension of life after death in a way that I think will satisfy all the parties concerned. I think that the method I'm describing entirely gets around the standard skeptical objections to these things.
Yeah, and I think, I raised this with John earlier, it's as if the orthodox science community doesn't quite realize that they're looking for internal self-consistency with respect to a reference frame that they use, which is distance time. And they're so trapped into that they've forgotten that that's what they do rather than study nature in all its glory. And it's hard for them to get out of that. They're pretty much stuck in the fact that they realize that's their limitation at this point in time. So it looks like you and I are both working on ways to help them get unstuck.
Yes, I think so. And, you know, I think paradoxically one of the groups that are stuck on this question are the people who take it seriously.
Yes.
and that I think that parapsychologists have been slow to admit that that some of their methodological presuppositions are too heavily grounded in the scientism that you're describing, Bill. I mean,
yes. Mm-hmm.
One of the great mistakes we've made in Western civilization in the last couple of 100 years is to assume, because of the obvious great progress and advances that scientific method has made, that therefore the only rational method of determining the truth is the scientific method, and that's just not the case. Philosophy.
I would like to enter and say it isn't that the scientific method isn't the appropriate way to do it, but if you see these kinds of anomalies relative to the reference frame you use for viewing nature in order to get internal self-consistency, and if you find that you can't get internal self-consistency with everything that appears to be happening, then the true scientific method is that you must expand your reference frame.
Well, or another way of saying it, I suppose, is that we can't assume that scientific method is complete. Science itself is capable of growth and expansion and incorporating new insights. As a matter of fact, that has clearly happened just within the last century. Some of the principles of quantum mechanics, for example, defy conventions that originally defined the scientific method.
Absolutely, but the dilemma that exists in our world today, I particularly am sensitive to it because of the What the Bleep movie that I was part of, is that the general public somehow think that quantum mechanics can deal with these consciousness questions. However, the formal mathematical foundation of today's quantum mechanics is distance and time. And the phenomena we're talking about are not distance-related and not time-related. So there's got to be an expansion of the reference frame to be able to deal with it.
And I think also that the investigators in this field, as I said, even the ones who take the question of life after death seriously, that we are going to have to acknowledge now that maybe our that we can improve our methods. I think parapsychology, by and large, has stuck with methods of the same methods of inquiry tenaciously, and I think it's just based on a very oversimplified model.
I think so too.
But I think I want to make a prediction, and that is that I say that a small amount of genuine progress toward rational comprehension of the question of life after death has now been made, and I believe I can prove it. I'm quite happy to put that challenge out to my colleagues and ask them to find weaknesses or flaws in my logic, because having challenged a lot of my colleagues with that task now, none of them are able to find weaknesses in this, and if it continues to hold up, we are into an entirely new era in investigating the question of life after death based on rational methodologies.
I agree.
But Raymond, if I want to add something, and also to Bill's comments a little bit earlier, isn't it Dag Hammarskjöld who said the way we look at death determines the way we look at life? I think it's the same.
Absolutely.
Very important.
And I think it's the same with how we look at science. And if I hear Bill talk about these reference frames, then I think automatically a joke comes to my mind, thinking that it's a flat world again, only we just don't know it. This time we do not use a boat to not fall off the Earth and find out that it's round, but it's another planet. It's not round anymore. Maybe it's a vortex tetrahedron, and we just have to find out. But for real, I think the way we look at death determines the way we look at life. It's the same with science and science paradigms. So I think we're very near, very close to, like Kuhn, the science philosopher says, a new paradigm and a revolution in this. And it's also energetics, because if I look at healing, and I think Bill can comment on that as well, but you probably as well, it's a biochemical paradigm, while just the electromagnetic paradigm in itself is not even complete. So science doesn't necessarily have to reflect on reality in its totalness. That's what I want to add.
Yeah, well, I'd like to add to that, when you brought up the business of healing, the experiments that I've been doing with the reconnection healing folks over the past 3 to 4 years, shows that in the process of them lecturing to people and doing workshops to teach the healing, there is, because we have a measuring instrument that can measure what is happening in the room in terms of its gauge symmetry state change, that the change that is seen is an increase in the thermodynamic free energy in the room, but the room temperature changes very little. That is, we see effects that if you wanted to produce them by heating a normal room,
you would be fried.
To heat them something like 300 degrees centigrade, whereas the temperature change in the actual working room is something like 5 degrees centigrade, and therefore it says it's not energy, it is information that has been exchanged, and therefore there's been a growth of information. And what that means, since the work of Shannon 60 years ago, that means a reduction in the thermodynamic entropy. So it's an entropic effect that is occurring when this healing occurs. You see, because it's the thermodynamic free energy that is driving a change in that. It drives all processes in nature that we know about. And the thermodynamic free energy has a pressure volume term, it has an energy term, and it has a temperature times entropy term. And in the old way of people looking at these things, the feeling was in the 1920s, for example, is that every process in nature up to then was one that increased the entropy of the universe as a byproduct, and therefore it reduced the thermodynamic free energy, and eventually everything would go cold and be dead. However, this, as we see with the healing stuff, that in fact it is that the information content in the universe is growing, and therefore the entropy is decreasing in that case. I mean, it doesn't mean that there isn't the positive entropy terms. They're still there, but the more one works to increase information development inside of humans become the carrier of this information. And that means that entropy is being reduced on our planet and in our universe, and therefore it's restoring the potential to the universe.
Is this also thinning the veil, Bill?
Beg your pardon?
Could you also call this the thinning of the veil between the dimensions?
The thinning of the veil, yeah. Well, that is occurring, exactly. That has been occurring for some time. Let me just say a little bit, and I don't want to take away from your time, Raymond. It is about 10 years ago, a man by the name of Enserick noted that 15 to 20 years earlier, the placebo effect in double-blind experiments was about 5 to 10%. Very small. But at the time that he wrote this paper in Science, it's a very short paper, the placebo effect had grown to something like 70 to 80%. So many double-blind experiments failed because of it. And people wanted to sweep it under the rug because it was a no-no kind of thing. However, he was curious, and I was curious. What is going on in nature that is giving rise to this increased placebo effect?
How can a fake drug work even better in its fakeness? That's the question, right?
Exactly. And the issue is that when you look at the coupled level of reality, the coupled state, then you can begin to see that when you do an experiment with a doctor and a treatment and a placebo and a subject, that at the reciprocal space level, this magnetic information wave level, it's a domain in which the quantities are basically vectors, and so you have to add up all the vectors for the system, and you work out the mathematics. The mathematics requires that what we experimentally measure is not that vector, that amplitude. We measure the intensity, which is the product of the total vector times its complex conjugate, which means you end up with a system of terms in which every aspect of the experiment is squared, but you get a term which is the product, a sum of the products of each of the elements in the experiment. So that means that the doctor term is multiplied by the placebo term, and the treatment term is multiplied by the placebo term, and the subject term is multiplied by the placebo term. So the placebo in our normal electric atom molecule reality is inert. But when you go to the duplex space area, you find that you end up with the sum of these products. If the doctor changes his mind about what's going on, that's going to manifest itself in the placebo effect. Mm-hmm. And if you have a good treatment, then it's also in the placebo effect when you have this coupled level of reality, etc. So you can begin to see automatically how the placebo effect is where it is right now. Again, but it's part of something that's also it's going on in nature outside of ourselves. I mean, I'm able to do these things with a device, but I'm sort of pumping up a system the same way you do when you want to make a laser. In that case, you have to have an inverted states of energy states, but you have to pump the system. So my experiments are producing these class of phenomena by pumping the system, but nature seems to be capable of doing it alone to certain levels of reality, and it will in time, that ingredient seems to be growing in nature that is increasing the connectivity between us. And that's also part of the reason why in the last few decades, I think we have been seeing these things that are called dark energy and dark matter. It's because of the coupling that's occurring between the unseen vacuum levels of reality, that stuff, with the normal electric atom molecule stuff.
So, Bill, if I can interrupt for just a short, I'm thinking, when I'm hearing you say this, it sounds as if when we are pumping the system with attention work, the cosmos at the same time, from the other bilateral communication information highway, is doing the same, thereby changing the system, making the coupling for us even easier. And that's why the placebo effect is even stronger, because it reminds me of psychoneuroimmunology. It's about suggestion and convictions, and it's like a scientific paradigm, but then in emotional conviction and psychological convictions. Talking about these convictions, because I have a question to Mr. Moody, which might add into this conversation, actually.
I think it will. If you will forgive me, I need to go take a bladder break, and I'm just short. I'll come back. So
okay, then
sorry to miss this, Raymond, but I'll get back to you.
I did a good timing. Okay, see you in the future. Mr. Moody, I think I have a question. I talked to Bill. You didn't hear that, so I'll rephrase that. Talking about reincarnations and why it might take different lifetimes to have the whole information together for the human being. That's a very broad terms, the role of reincarnation, the possible role. So I have like a little bit of a cheat question. I'm actually being your friend here, but I think it's an interesting question to get information from. Could you say that returning to life after a near-death experience could be called cheating on your karma, or a growing spurt, like a growing spurt into lessons to be learned, spirituality about the meaning of life and being human? And a question coupled to that, what about the light beings? I mean, some people say fantasy, others say it's a broken brain. I don't, but a dissociation response because of fear of death, so you make it easier on yourself? Or is it a real multidimensional being? How do we become light beings? This is one question came up, and someone asked, can I trust this tunnel? Is it a holographic insertion? Is it real? Is it your imagination? I know people who had a near-death experience know for sure it's real, but what's your opinion on this important issue, I think?
Well, John, I think two major things are happening or have happened that are very rapidly now going to revolutionize the rational inquiry into life after death in the West. And one of these is in regard to the question you ask about whether these near-death experiences could be accounted for by a broken brain. I think that we are very quickly now going to have to abandon that kind of debate because
there's no brain.
What we know now is that it is very common for bystanders at the bedside of a dying loved one that as the person in the bed dies, the bystanders themselves have all of these features that we now call a near-death experience. So near-death experiences are no longer connected just to the dying brain, because if they are a product of the oxygen deprivation that occurs when someone almost dies, why should the bystanders who are not ill or injured have the same experiences? And I call this this development of the phenomenon shared death experiences.
I call that information entanglement.
Yes, identical experiences to those who almost die, and yet they occur without the context of a brain damage. But that's one thing, and I think that totally undermines the classical skeptical argument that these things are, in essence, brain damage. Furthermore, we now have entirely new techniques of analysis and rational thought that really enable us to grapple with the concept of life after death in an entirely new way. And John, I would like to mention, with your permission, that I am coming to Holland in April. Great. I'm coming with the Fifth Dimension in Holland is giving a series of 2-day intensive workshops in which I present to people a program that essentially reformats the mind for rational thinking about these things that thus far have been beyond the domain of logic. And if I could give a reference as to where you can find out about this, it's on the World Wide Web, www.Fifth Dimension, which is there in Holland. And on their website, they describe these programs I will be giving in Holland. And the reason I say this is that I am really excited, John and Bill. I do want to challenge my colleagues all over the world to say, by saying, I have made a small but genuine step forward toward rational comprehension of the afterlife, and have also, in that connection, articulated an entirely new system of logic that we can use for thinking rationally about these things. And I make that challenge because as a philosophy professor, I am fully willing, if my colleagues can show flaws in my reasoning process, I would be happy to accept correction because that would bring me closer to the truth. However, it does appear that specialists in logic and religious studies and psychology and other fields to whom I have submitted this work have thus far endorsed it because they can find no logical breakdowns in it. So I hope when I come to Holland in April for a couple of weeks to be able to demonstrate this in a very vivid way. So I am looking forward to this encounter.
That's great. That's great, Raymond. While we're on that, I would like also to mention to the audience that the things that I have been talking about, they can go to my website, www.tiller.org, and see the books and the DVDs. And at the moment, there's 13 white papers that are free for people to both read and print for themselves on the website.
Okay, and of course you have the books Science of Adventures with Real Magic, some Science Adventures with Real Magic, Conscious Acts of Creation, and Science and Human Transformation. And Mr. Raymond A. Moody has a book in Dutch, it's called Vorige Levens, Life Before Life. And the other one in Dutch is Over de Grens van Leven en Dood, which is Reunions. And the other one, the famous one, De Tunnel en het Licht, and in English, The Light Beyond. And I have to add that my old music publisher, very ironically, Strenghold Publishing have just released Leven na dit leven, or are still releasing. Al 80,000 exemplaren verkocht, so 80,000 pieces sold. So that's good news. So the new book from Dr. Raymond Moody, Leven na dit leven, Life After Life, is available through Strenghold. And I'm sure want to be at the workshop to experience what you just said, Raymond, because I want this enlightenment before I die, which sounds good to me. So,
if I can add one that was missed, was my most recent book, which is Psychoenergetic Science, a second Copernican scale revolution.
Oh, that's true. That's the one. Even not for the layperson, but an even more accessible book with also some new information. Okay. Yes. So I'm missing out on one book. What a shame on me. Okay. Raymond, I still have one important question, I think, because that came into my mind. And while I still have a brain, that's a good thing. Do you think the success of reanimation depends on the higher self's decision to return into the body? And the next question would be, how does consciousness find its own body again? And what are the criteria, so to speak, for this U-turn of life? How does this come
my
up?
Goodness, John, those are wonderful questions. And first of all, I would be foolish to tell you that I was able to give the exact correct answers, and like you must be, I too am baffled by this. But I think that one thing that we have done in the West with the wonderful success of our material science is that we have relegated consciousness to a secondary role. And I have always felt, John, and I suspect that this is true of you and Bill as well, that the primary thing is consciousness. I think that Descartes wasn't far wrong when he said that as we inspect inside ourselves, we quickly see that what we are certain of is that we are conscious. And anything beyond that is inferential. That is, we only have inferential knowledge about the possibility of an external world, whereas we have direct intuitive knowledge of the existence of our own conscious awareness. And so that's an attitude I've had throughout my life. I think the primary reality to be explained is consciousness. And I think that we have systematically deluded ourselves in the West over the past couple of 100 years into a fantasy that we are on the verge of explaining consciousness by purely material and electrochemical brain processes. I think that this is a cherished myth which that we really must abandon in the West before we can make real progress in comprehending the most important question of all, because isn't it really obvious, certainly to people as they grow older, that the most important question of existence really is whether we survive bodily death. That is the question which, in a very real sense, Western thought began, indeed even with which logical thinking began. And yet we have systematically relegated to that question to the shadows, and academia, sadly, is ashamed to ask the question anymore.
I agree with that, and the issue is that in the old days there were two companionable paths to knowledge, one being logos and the other being mythos. One looked out at nature, the other looked internally at nature. And logos, of course, became science, and mythos is where all the avatars were playing.
Yes, and I continue to think, really, in reality, the person who still has articulated the best and most plausible and comprehensible case for rational inquiry into life after death remains Plato in his Republic and Phaedo. And what Plato points out in there is that when we're speculating about the question of an afterlife, there always must be a narrative element, Plato said. That is, that there always must be some sort of story, because the concept or the notion of an afterlife is too nebulous for us to think about without some sort of story element which enables us to imagine what it might be like. So there always must be a story. And one thing I think we're seeing now is that the story that we've been very comfortable with in the West for about 30 or 35 years now, namely that people who almost die and get resuscitated tell us of going out of their bodies through a tunnel into a light, meeting relatives, seeing their life pass in review, coming back to their body and returning to life. And now, in addition to that storyline, which is very well established in the West, we now have to take into account that that same story is told by bystanders at death, who say that as their loved one dies, the bystanders themselves get out of their body, go through a tunnel, may even see the life of the dying person pass in review, and tell us that their conviction is that they empathically co-lived the dying experience of a loved one. Now, that is very powerful information that totally eliminates the neurophysiological attempts to come to an understanding of this. If it is just the brain winding down upon death, why should the bystanders who are not ill or injured have identically these same experiences? I think that when this information comes out, as it will surely over the next few months and couple of years, we are going to be in an entirely new state of debate about this most important of all questions.
Yeah, can I expand that? Because it's interesting. If you look at what has been called the guru-chela relationship, I have interpreted that as the chela is building information into self, and has acquired a lot, but isn't able to manifest and materialize many of the phenomena that the guru can. But in the biofield of the guru, which seems to me we always are radiating what we are, then in that presence, a short physical distance, there is enough of the other needed components to manifest the phenomena that the chela can manifest to them in his presence, and therefore it's like priming the pump. Once you get it going, your system starts to be able to do it on its own, and of course that's the way it goes. And the chela then, after a while, no longer needs to be in the vicinity of the guru to manifest those things. Now, you and I, Raymond, have done this with PhD students. In essence, they come, we design a PhD thesis for them, and in essence, we help them, we think, just from our consciousness statements and such, but it's also our biofields. And they learn how to do it on their own eventually. I mean, you probably have the same experience as I have had. That is, it is a wonderful day when the PhD student really comes to own his own thesis.
Yes, and it's usually during the first year of teaching. I remember I got my PhD in philosophy when I was only 24 years old, so I put in a huge amount of information over a short period of time. And then when I began to be a philosophy professor myself, I learned this information in a new way by teaching it to students. Teaching and learning are intimate, just different parts of the same process, I think.
Very much so. When I wanted to learn a new field, I would commit myself to giving a lecture course in it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Talking about lectures, when I just heard the two of you speak, especially you, Mr. Moody, when you talked about this, which I think is very important, these people who are the shared death experience, you're calling it, right? That's another name which will stick in the books for 60 years, I think, like the near-death experience.
Terribly important.
But I was immediately thinking about the observer effect and the measurement effect in quantum mechanics, and of course the Heisenberg principle and the uncertainty principle, but also the bystander effect of people psychologically just doing nothing but standing there, but having the same emotions a lot of the time. And when you, Bill, talked about your experience and your explanation and the addition of information, I thought about Jonathan Goldman, who spoke of harmonic information transfer when he was at an avatar or a master, whatever you want to call it, and he wanted to have this monochord kind of singing with one voice. You can make a chord, which those Buddhist monks sometimes can, and just being in the presence for a long time of this person, all of a sudden he just couldn't do it, and one day he woke up and he just had this chord. He could make this chord because he was probably too long in the vicinity of what you might call the structured coherence intention effect, which is being coupled and entangled and amplified so that it crosses over as information multidimensionally to something which becomes a cognitive function or emotional function. So there's actual proof of energetic information transfer non-locally, which can be reinforced by just being at someone who has this biofields and these characteristics you want to couple with, to resonate with, that it really works.
Yeah, and we find, in our case, we see at room temperature and macroscopic systems like a room, we see information transfer over at least up till now 6,000 miles, and it seems to be very different than quantum entanglement, but it may not be. But the issue is once the system comes to this coupled state where you are interacting now between the electric atom molecule level and the coarsest level of the physical vacuum. Once that state is achieved, then you are connected tremendously, and the stronger is the coupling coefficient, then the stronger is the connection.
You're in.
It can be over great distance, it can be over time. We're seeing it in time, this kind of entanglement, future time. So it's a very, very interesting process. The mathematics is not all laid out yet, but we're making progress.
Well, I'm also thinking about, you probably both know the work in the book, The Intention Experiment of Raymond Moody, and probably before that book also the work of Cleve Baxter with his plants, measuring the reaction to plants to even the threat of hurting the plants. And I just read one study which also reminded me of the one cellular algae, I believe it was, that Roland, I lost his last name, with the Biophotonic Institute at Professor Pop, or Eduard van Wijk, Eduard van Wijk did with a parapsychological session.
Van Wijk.
Yeah, Roel van Wijk and Eduard van Wijk. And there was a witness, just one cell animal without a brain, and here it comes, and it lighted up more when there was a parapsychological healing session. And the stuff which also reminded me of Cleve Baxter with the plants, but there was also one study where like the bacteria in a dirty toilet, well, if you clean your toilet you don't have them anymore, but in a dirty toilet there are always some bacteria, and he threw boiling hot water on top of the bacteria, while at the same time measuring the electrodermal responses, I believe, by a line detector at plants which were non-locally responding for many yards further in even closed rooms. So plants reacting emotionally to the death cries of a near-death experience of a bacteria in a toilet. I mean, what about...
No, I think the connection of all of these things that that Raymond was saying, to connecting through the work that I've and my colleagues have been doing to what you just said, I think that's going to be a very interesting story a decade down the road, because people will make that connection.
Okay, Mr. Moody, one question, because I know you. There's one person very famous here in Holland, and his name is Pim van Lommel, and I know that you know him for, I think, 20, 30 years, I thought I heard you say.
Well, I think about, 20-something years,
Yeah, so I thought that was fascinating.
88.
Yeah, that's a way back. But it's also a way back when you became, when you did your PhD in philosophy. That's another thing I just heard. That's a lot of years back. Okay, but what I wanted to ask you is, according to Pim van Lommel, when we die, he doesn't call it what we call in Holland hiernamaals. He likes to say that we enter an interconnected other dimension. Would you agree with that?
That's exactly what people tell me, because certainly one of the things that come out of near-death experiences and also out of these shared death experiences is that people say that as life comes to a close, you see your entire life reviewed in a sort of holographic panorama in which your connections with others become very obvious, because in the panoramic review of your life, you see the actions of your life reviewed not from the point of view that you had when you performed those actions, but rather from the point of view of those who were on the receiving end of the action.
Like a karmic mirror, so to speak?
Yes, and that if you see yourself doing there an unkind or a mean-spirited action to a fellow human being, then in this review of your life, you feel directly and empathically the sad feelings you've brought about in that person's life. And also, if you see yourself in that review doing a loving and kind-spirited action to someone else, then you feel the good feelings you brought about in the life of that person. So, in a very real way, yes, I believe that everything is deeply interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Well, on another sad level, you're talking about sad feelings. Another very practical approach to NDE also has a sad attachment to it, because I found out that 50% of the relationships actually end after someone has had a near-death experience, because what people are reporting, it's just not the same partner anymore I used to live with all these years.
Oh, yes, I hear that all the time, that even very long-term marriages, for example, can get disrupted after one partner has a near-death experience, because the other partner who hasn't had such an experience can never figure out why the person has transformed so dramatically.
Okay, well, we're going to have some additional small break, but I hope it's going to be a special one, because I'm going to couple it to two aspects before we take off with the music. I believe I sent the songs to the both of you. It's a song I produced myself with my partner, and it's called Prayer for the Children, Prayer for the World. It's even a song which was seen before by a psychic, before we even got the information from the cosmos, so to speak. So that was a beautiful personal experience. But I want to couple two things from your side, Mr. Moody, and from Bill Tiller's side. One is the paradise music. I'm thinking, where are the CD players on the other side, and where are all the musical instruments? So that, I think that's fascinating. And to couple that to the intention work of what like Bill Tiller and Lynn McTaggart are doing, I like to ask the viewers, if they want, you don't need to, hey, we have free will, but if you want, maybe think of Haiti, maybe think of a better world, a peace for the world. And there's a message from my daughter, actually recorded in my studio here, for this world, and I want to ask the technician if he wants to play it, and maybe we can put a coherent intention or a visualization or whatever you want to do while listening to the music, because music, like Pim Verlommel says, adds another dimension. So we're going to take an extra break with this music and we'll come back in, I believe, about 3.5 minutes. Okay, in a few.
Okay.
This is for all the children in the whole world. All the children sing out the song of life, of love, of joy, of freedom, for all the love, all the life. Live in peace, harmony. World these shouts.
I pray for the children. I pray for the child. I pray for my inner child. I pray for my child. I pray for the children. I pray for the child. I pray for
Okay, listeners, we're back multidimensionally, privately and informally with Raymond Moody and Bill Tiller. I'm your host, John Consemulder, and you just listened to a song I produced with my wife, Prayer for the Children, and the last vocals were from our then 2.5-year-old child, Ishaya. And it still touches me, and the reason I'm playing it now is actually... Here's a NDE testimony, which is from John J. Harper's book, Transformers. He's going to be in one of the next episodes, by the way. But he's giving an NDE testimony clarifying his main point. Reverend Howard Storm was taken to the center of a galaxy during his NDE, finding himself hovering in space, sensing profound feelings of love and compassion for creation. He was intercepted by several beings of light. Well, the story goes on, but what's interesting, he also learned that we must begin working in harmony with each other internationally if we are to restore it to its Garden of Eden condition. That's what he found out with the communication. And Storm saw, and this was amazing, that prayer itself has the power to invoke miracles beyond our wildest expectation by tapping the energetic psychic resources of Mother Earth, as he wrote in My Descent into Death and the Message of Love, which brought me back. They showed me plants with prayer would produce huge fruits and vegetables. In addition, he discovered people in unison could control the climate of the planet through prayer. Well, and it goes on, but what I thought was fascinating, well, this is especially the same story Raymond Moody is talking about in all his books, and it shows that real focused intention, you might call it love, you might call it compassion, empathy, or yes, you might even call it a prayer, really can have these kind of results according to the light beings some NDE experience are communicating with telepathically. And I want to add, praying doesn't necessarily mean you have to believe in God. You can, but you don't have to. Praying for a certain outcome, for me, is the most loving intention you can put out in the world. And I think it's a very good sign that if we can believe these stories from an NDE testimony, that on the other side we get collaboration on these insights. I think we need to implement worldwide to really have a new world order, but not as the politicians would want it, but an order of coherence brought by love and good intentions. So I think to add to that, to Mr. Bill Tiller, how can we reinforce this domino effect of conditioning, which seems to happen with non-local intention? And what are the conditions we need to focus on if we want to work with intention successfully? How do we agree on what intentions to use and to implement for a better world? Can we actually heal the world? What's your view on how to do that?
Well, I think we all radiate what we are all the time. So we are transmitters and receivers, and we do this at all levels. It's the expression of what we are. And it's one's attitudes, thoughts, attitudes, and actions that are important. And we're doing this, and so the issue is to hold the intention within one's heart. Come to see the world through your heart as distinct from just through your brain. And that's something that each of us can do. Many people think it's much more interesting to do the big thing with the big show and so on. But in fact, you can do this while you're washing the dishes, while you're minding your children, while you're walking in the street. It's just realize that you are always a transmitter. And if you hold the intention with desire, you've got to give it emotion in the sense you really have to want to do it. And if we each would get to the place of doing that, then it will be much easier to coordinate into a group. The issue is you might want large numbers to do it. That certainly will strengthen things. But unless you are coherent, it won't happen. You've got to transform yourself before you can transform others and transform our world. So this is a personal responsibility that each of us must take on. And of course, we must believe that it is possible to make these kinds of change. We must give that meaning in our lives. Then our unconscious will strengthen that meaning. It will provide information for us and enhance power, because we will individually become more and more coherent. And the more coherent we become, the stronger we will be as a transmitter and a receiver.
So first the willingness, and then the coupling effort. That's the responsibility.
Yes, you've got to have the willingness. You've got to be willing to serve the larger whole. You've got to be willing to put your ego in service to the larger whole, which means all of your efforts.
I'm also automatically thinking, if the universe is a whole, then what causes what?
We are all part of that.
Yes.
We are part of everything. And there's, we talk about death, but really that's just taking off the bio-body suit, the personality self. Our core is not space-time related. It is at a deeper level of the universe, which in my modeling is a frequency domain. So it's everywhere and every when.
In the resonance.
Yes, in the resonance. And so if all the higher dimensions travel faster than light, and they all are frequency domains, then you can have resonance from the domains of spirit down through mind, through emotion, and manifest and materialize in our electric atom molecule world.
Okay, I'm very curious if Mr. Raymond Moody also has the same view or a different view on how we could actually heal the world and first ourselves and work with intention, because I know, after reading all these testimonies of people who survived death, so to speak, the near-death experiencers, that, well, they learned their lesson maybe late, but they got a great chance to do it right, returning into life. So I'm very curious what your opinion is on this one.
Oh, yes, absolutely, John. I feel that for us to constantly keep in our mind what people tell us who've been to the brink of death, that in the closing moments of life, what they see is their whole life portrayed around them in a panorama, and they witness directly the impact that their actions, bad and good, have had upon others. And so to constantly keep that in mind, I think, keeps us constantly aware of the complete interdependence and interconnection we have with every other human being.
Mm-hmm. And if I look at near-death experience, I'm seeing that it's a universal experience, a universal element.
Oh, yeah.
Everything's connected to everything. There's love, acceptance, no pain, life panorama. Every thought and emotion is remembered, and like a karmic mirror, it gets reflected back to you to learn from. And it's clear consciousness and perception, and that without a brain. But what I thought was fascinating, of course, as a sound healer and music producer, but there are these reports of beautiful paradise music, and I'm thinking, where are these CD players? Where are the instruments? Where's the choir?
Yes. And George Ritchie, who was the first living person I ever knew who had a near-death experience, described that music to me, and he said that, first of all, there are no words to describe it. And he said that, however, he said the closest way he could describe it is to say that it was a lot closer to Beethoven than it was to rock and roll. But nonetheless, even within that framework, ultimately indescribable, beyond words.
The blind man opened his eyes in the other dimension. Okay, so comatose is not brain dead, the critics are saying, but we're seeing that studies using an internal defibrillator is actually a bit of proof for at least survival of consciousness without brain activity. But of course, that not definitely proves life after death, but it does for the people returning into life with their personal experience. But my question is, how does, because that's also referring to life as we know it right now, how does the NDE, the near-death experience, relate to OBE, the out-of-body experience, in your experience?
Well, I would say that out-of-body experiences are sometimes brought about by other factors. For example, even being in nature. Actually, astronomers gazing into their telescopes through interstellar reaches will sometimes have out-of-body experiences, and indeed even classical musicians, you might be interested to know, John, sometimes when they are performing great pieces will say that they seem to leave their body and go into a light.
Yeah, trance states, yeah.
That's right, and out-of-body experiences are one part of a near-death experience, but near-death experiences also include elements in addition to the out-of-body experience, and that consists, for example, of seeing one's life in review and meeting relatives, the spirits of relatives who passed away.
Mm-hmm. So maybe an interesting question. I'm not sure if Bill is still listening. Oh, by the way, Bill, if you are, and Raymond, we have additional time. So if you need to go, then of course we can wrap up the interview and just thank everybody. But there's no broadcast after this one. So if we want to address questions or answers, we can. So I'll leave that up to you to.
I do need to go.
Okay.
But I want to add one thing.
Of course.
The out-of-body experience, the body is a space-time, what we think of is a space-time construct. And so it's just going to the other domains, the other reference frames that are needed to look at the larger aspects of nature. So near-death experience is, in fact, that aspect. It couples with those frequency domains as distinct from the distance-time domain, and so they're both accessing that domain. So they are in fact very much connected, in my view.
To the biohologram.
Yeah, I think so. I think the holographic picture is an important one, but of course, anything dealing with waves ultimately is internally self-consistent with a hologram. So, but I'm going to have to go now, and so I will say goodbye to you, John, and to you, Raymond. And but by all means, continue if you wish.
Right.
Okay. Well,
thank you, John. I'm happy to stay.
Well, then we'll continue. But in the meantime, I want to thank you, Bill, for being in this show. And please keep in touch, because I think and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, you're, as a scientist but also as a spiritual person, your intention work is actually, that's what I feel and know and can see as a scientist, proving that we don't have to question anymore if we have to believe in something to work. There's actual science and proof and explanations for the fact that we can better believe because it's true. It's a reality, and it's a reality we can focus on some more to make a better world collectively.
I think so. I think we humans are so much more than we think we are.
True.
And we are just babes crawling across the floor of the universe in our evolutionary progress.
Yes, and you are showing us light bulbs that we are more than just this energy coming from it. Yes, so you're actually lighting us up, and in a good way. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to thank you for this interview, and I hope we'll speak some more later soon.
Okay, it's been a great experience.
Okay, thank you. Likewise.
Enjoy. Again, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Bill. Okay, so listeners, we are still on, so don't put out your internet connection, because we are still connected with Bill Tiller, also non-locally, but then from another level, not by phone, but still connected with Raymond Moody. And I want to check for some extra questions which might be interesting for some new information. And I have one, a very deep one actually. Raymond, what I want to ask you, in your opinion or in the opinion of people having this near-death experience, is life, according to the telepathic contacts with with people the near-death experiences are connected with, or telepathically, or in what form they're now meeting them. Is life just meant for Earth, according to these experiences that are into contact with light beings? Is life as we know it here unique for this planet? And what's the supporting message NDE experiences have for life in general, here and now?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, John, I think that, having talked with thousands of people from all over the world with near-death experiences, I think that the universal theme that I hear again and again, and that is that whatever these people had been chasing prior to their experience, whether they were chasing power or fame or money, or as in the case of some of us, such as myself, chasing knowledge, that after this experience they come back to say that the what this life that we're in is all about ultimately is love, the knowledge of love and the ability to cultivate loving relationships with our fellow human beings. So I think that is the most dominant theme that stands out all over the world, is the importance and power of love. That is the theme that seems to hold all of these transcendent death experiences together.
Wow. Okay. Well, that reminds me of the song "Pray for the Children," and my little one spoke out the message, because it's also about the inner child, and which is of course the nurturing of loving your inner child as well, and loving others in harmony. And this book I spoke about, this Transformers from John J. Harper, which I think is, if you don't know it, a good book for you to. This is my little one coming right into this radio show, as you can hear, and giving me a hug. So this is one telepathic contact, knowing what it's all about. Yeah, Yeshua? Yeah. Yeah. Wil je wat zeggen? Maybe she wants to say something live in the... May je zitten? Yeah, she wants to sit with me. Well, she can sit with me. My wife is looking at me in a strange way because she's not realizing we are still live on the radio show. And now both our two children are here with us.
Wonderful.
But the book is from John J. Harper, and he said something, our mission is to grow God through becoming a Christ. And Melvin Morris, which you probably also know, he talked about developing intuition, and he viewed intuition as to communicate directly with God. And I thought that was fascinating, because here they come again, because intuition and intuitive abilities is something, and I thought that was fascinating, NDE experiences seem to have more of when they return to life.
Yes, absolutely. And people say that when they are in this other state of existence they enter into when they almost die, that verbal communication through sound is no longer possible, but that the contact that they have with these beings of light, and also with the spirits of their deceased relatives that are there to meet them, does take place not through sound, but rather through heart-to-heart or mind-to-mind communication, or telepathic or intuitive, as you call it. Again, we really don't have the words for this, but it's a common claim of people with near-death experiences that as soon as you're out of your body, sounds go away. What comes then is communication through thought, and you directly intuit and experience the thoughts and feelings of other beings with whom you're connected.
Okay, so one question which comes up to my mind, because we spoke about this, higher beings, Christ consciousness, and the survival of the soul consciousness, is the near-death experience in a way affirming some ancient shamanic knowledge, which you in a new jacket might call the binary soul doctrine?
Oh yes, absolutely. There is a complete continuum, John, between shamanic otherworld journeys and the phenomena that we call near-death experiences. And even to go back to the writings of Plato, for example, the Republic, you see this very clearly, that Plato's Republic concludes with the near-death experience of a warrior named E.R. of Armenia, and it's very plain that Ur's voyage into the other world is completely consistent with the shamanic voyages into the afterworld. I think, sadly, in the West, we've gotten away from the knowledge of the history of ancient Greek philosophy, but that's something that we really need to take back in the West, is our classical education in these things, because there is an unbreakable continuum from the earliest philosophers right through to the modern debate about near-death experiences. For example, while Plato accepted near-death experiences as prima facie evidence of an afterlife, Democritus, for example, the ancient Greek philosopher who was a contemporary of Plato's and who developed the atomic theory of matter, said in effect that reality consists of atoms in the void, and that these near-death experiences, which he also knew about and wrote about, were to Democritus just the manifestations of the dying brain. And so this debate between the physiologically minded scholars and on the other hand, scholars who are willing to allow that these near-death experiences may be visitations to an afterlife, that this same debate has been going on for thousands of years. It's not anything new to our 20th and 21st century existence.
So we still have this mechanistic versus idealistic viewpoints, and they were already there in this very ancient philosophy.
Absolutely, John. And you know, one of the most astounding facts of history to me, which just simply doesn't get discussed in the modern world because it is so sensational that it is incredible, but nonetheless it is true, and that is that the logic that we have, upon which our modern society depends, came to us through ancient Greek philosophers. The fundamental concepts originated with the ancient Greek philosopher Parmenides, for example.
Yes, you talked about that in your talk. Yes, I remember. Yeah.
Yes, and that Parmenides, who was a second-generation student of Pythagoras, went to the other side in one of these shamanic otherworld journeys and brought back the concept of logical truth, upon which modern reasoning still depends. Well, so we cannot separate the rational search for truth from the spiritual quest.
No, true. Well, I was laughing while you told this story, and not because it didn't make any sense or was comical to me, but because it reminded me of a very interesting remark you made when we met at the RAI conference where you did a talk, and I believe it was Dr. Eric Pearl who said exactly my thoughts. He said, "Man, put that on a T-shirt." Like, that was a good line. I believe you were the one who said, "Some things are the case no matter what people think of them."
Exactly, that's correct.
And that's a T-shirt, all right. So what I'm wondering, because I didn't find a lot of information about that in the literature, and if I saw something, it reflected this universal experience, the universal element, so not too much difference. But is the cause of death, that's does it get reflected to the NDE experience? Does it relate to the NDE experience and the differences in reporting these kind of experiences?
Apparently not, John. And as a matter of fact, people tend to report the same kinds of near-death experiences, no matter what particular cause it was that brought them to the brink of death, whether a heart attack or a severe infection or a trauma or an incident of childbirth or whatever the particular cause was from which the person almost died. The near-death experience seems to be the same.
Okay, so it is a universal thing. Well, at least it seems to be a universal thing regarding those reports. Okay, and I asked the question before a bit jokingly, but now I'm asking seriously. How does consciousness recognize its own body it's supposed to get back into? How does that work? Do you have any clues?
Well, it's not all. That's exactly right. It's not always an easy question. This psychiatrist that I heard talk about his experience in 1965, Dr. George Ritchie, who remains the finest human being I ever knew in my life. He said that when he got out of his body, he was a recruit in the Army in World War II, and he found himself in a huge Army hospital with many other young men about his age, and he literally could not recognize his body. And however, there's another sense in which I think this return takes place independently of what anybody might. It's not that they have to try to find their way back in. Rather, they describe it as being automatic. I hear many people say that they were outside of their body in this beautiful light, and then they found themselves returning to their body without any sense of transition. That is, that they played no part in it. They simply came back to their body without any sense of intervening.
It gets done. It's not a search. It just happens to you.
That's right.
Like death happened to you in the first place. It's that's instantaneous,
right.
So to speak.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I have one question which is quite a deep one, and it concerns, let's just call it as it is, extraterrestrials. And I'm always saying, well, if you look at wildlife here on Earth, or you just look at Discovery Channel to all these transparent fishes which give light, and you're looking at that, well, that's a life form as well on this planet. So what's extraterrestrial anyway? And if it's your higher self in a multidimensional world without a body, well, isn't that far off from being a light being or a ball of light or what we call an ET? But there was a question because what we find out that we now are experiencing new science, scalar electromagnetics and bioacoustic, but also bioholographic projections and phase conjugation, different kind of techniques to have like a very persistent illusion, because all matter and all life, as we now find out from NDE experience, is a very persistent illusion anyway. But that means it can go bilateral. So we can have white magic, so to speak, and black magic, depending on the intention or the effect you want to accomplish with this technological means. And where I'm going to is the question which is asked by someone on the chat, actually, that is it possible, and of course it's difficult to answer, but maybe you heard some stories about an NDE experiencing this. Is it possible that there could be sort of AET techniques tunneling or tuning us the wrong way in a kind of astral project beam kind of reality? So basically the question is quite far-fetched, but reality sometimes is more far-fetched than we think it is. Might it be possible that somebody could be led astray with a kind of projection, as if this would be the other worlds or your past life or your next life, because that's sometimes also what gets fed as information to an NDE experiencer. Have you ever heard about something like this?
Well, actually I haven't, John, so I have no basis from which to speculate. I will say this, that I have been an avid student of astronomy since I was 7 years old, and I'm now 65, so that's 58 years that I have followed astronomy closely. And as you know, modern astronomy has established now that planets are ubiquitous all over the universe, and that we now know of over 400 exoplanets, that is, planets circling distant stars, and within the next few years we will know of many thousands of more. And really it has always seemed to me just inherently implausible to assert that there's a life on the Earth, but that out of these trillions of other planets that we are the only planet that harbors life or intelligent life just seems to me to be rather implausible on the face of it. And in regard to that question of the connection with experiences of life after death with extraterrestrial life, I can say this, that in the 21st century we regard the question of extraterrestrial life as entirely separate from the question of life after death.
Sure.
But if we go back only a couple of hundred years, these questions were intimately connected in the public eye. For example, when Kant in the 18th century and other astronomers of that period were beginning to realize that, in their opinion, all these distant stars were no doubt circled by stars too, by planets too. To people in that frame of reference, it seemed obvious that there must be intelligent inhabitants of other worlds. And so the biblical question then began, since Western society at that time was rather unidimensionally Christian, the question of how these other worlds related to the biblical statements arose. And so one very common kind of attitude which people had, say, in the 18th century, the 19th century, was that these inhabitants of distant worlds are related to us, either by being the spirits of our departed ancestors, or in other versions, by being distinct beings, but that nonetheless have a rational connection, a spiritual connection to us by the mere fact of being rational. You know, I think we all have to learn in school Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, the universal ethical principle he propounded, and what is not very well understood by many people, but which is nonetheless clearly there in the context of his life, is that by saying that this ethical principle held for all rational beings whatsoever, he meant not just human beings living on the earth, but rather intelligent beings that he believed existed and lived by rational principles on other worlds. So you know, it's in the public imagination, these questions are quite apart, the question of life after death and the question of extraterrestrial life. But nonetheless, we don't have to go too far back in our history to see that they were actually regarded as different faces of one and the same question.
Yeah. Well, 100 years ago, we wouldn't have believed we would have flying planes in the air. So things change probably with the perspectives of life and perspectives on science. But it's interesting that you're reflecting on actually a more kind of an openness and willingness to have a broader view on this multidimensional kind of life not too long ago, because we think we have progress in science, but actually this view might reflect reality more, because if we think of the NDE experience, these people are actually talking to light beings, are seeing their family who have disease. And these are not human beings with a body. They're in one way or another their higher selves or their family or whatever, but maybe what we call extraterrestrial. Well, actually, the word says it itself. It's out of this earth, actually. Well, I think God would be out of this earth, or your deceased parent would be out of this earth, because they're no longer in a formal human bodily form. So that's okay. That's interesting. Okay, thinking of the reanimation success which happens to people having this NDE, and of course I think it's 4 to 5% of the Western civilization, and in Pim van Lommel's report and research I believe it's even 18%. So that's quite a lot of people if you count them in numbers. But what would be maybe you have any insight from reports, because I know you have heard and read the thousands of them. What might have been the decisions to actually return into the body? So what are the criteria? Is there any insight? That's my question, into what happens when we cross life and we go through this tunnel and we go to the light and we get back. Did we just not learn our lessons, or is it far more complicated than that?
Well, it does seem to be quite complicated, John, and that is that of the many people I have interviewed who came to the brink of death and came back to life, there are three major patterns that people talk about in terms of how they came back. Some people tell us that they have no idea how they got back. They say at one moment they seem to be in this beautiful light in another world, and the next moment they found themselves back in their physical bodies with no sense of a transition, so that there was no intermediate state that they were conscious of. A second group of patients will tell us that they were told by this being of light, or perhaps by one of their relatives or friends of theirs who had died and who was there with them, that they had things left to do, that it wasn't their time to die yet, so that they had to go back. In other words, this second group of people say that they were told they had to return because they had unfinished business or things left to do.
Like a cosmic glitch.
That's right. And the third group of people say that in this experience they were told that they were given a choice. They said they were told that they can either stay in this light experience or they could go back to the life that they had been leading. And perhaps not too surprisingly, all of the people that I know who were given that choice chose to come back. But what I find very interesting, John, is that the reason they give is universally the same. They say that they chose that for themselves, they would rather have stayed in that light, but they chose to come back for someone else, for some other loved one. It most commonly it's a person who says that for themselves they would rather have lived, who have gone on into the light, but that they chose to come back because they have young children left to raise. And then others have told that it's for some other loved one. A long time ago, for example, one woman told me that she came back to life because she wanted to help her husband, who had severe alcoholism, and she wanted to return to help him. And then yet others who say that given a choice, they chose to come back because they had spent their life preparing for some profession, such as medicine or nursing or social work, in which they had desired to help other people. And given the choice to stay in the light or to return, they chose to return to this existence because they wanted to complete their profession of service to others.
That's interesting, because in my opinion that could mean that in this egoless state of interconnectedness and love and compassion, you automatically make the right choice while you're feeling, hey, this is paradise, I don't want to leave this place forever, I want to stay here forever, but you know what the heck, I'll do it for my child or for my profession because I can help people.
I can certainly empathize with that, John, as I'm sure you can with two young ones. I have two grown sons who are 38 and 35, and they are on their own now. And I also have two wonderful young children who are 11 and 9 and 9 years old. And for myself, I am not afraid of death, so I would be willing to die at any time, except that I want to stay around to help my young children and to get them started in life.
And of course help me out, because otherwise this radio program would be gone right now. We would have nothing left to talk about. But no, I'm just kidding. But I'm also thinking this pain experience, I think that's so interesting. These people are experiencing love, acceptance, no pain, gone.
Absolutely.
And then I'm thinking, and on the other way around, we have phantom pain here in this life. We don't have a leg left, but we have pain as if there's actually a nerve cell giving the message, okay, cross the brain, tell them to retract because this is pain. And we have this phantom pain experience in 3D life. But on the other hand, we lose the pain over there. But when we get back into the bodies, we have this pain again.
Absolutely. I've heard that from many people that they were perhaps injured and had severe pain, and they got out of their bodies and into this light, and the entire time they were out of their bodies, they felt no pain. But when they returned to their body at the end of their near-death experience, they experienced the pain again.
Yeah, interesting. And the same with the life panorama. I did a course once. Probably know him, Professor Dr. Hans Schedding. He's a professor now because of he director of the Parapsychological Institute in Utrecht. And that was, I think, 5 years back. I followed a course near-death experience and survival after death and reincarnation. And this person over there, I forgot his name. He's a well-known researcher here in Holland. He talked about his life panorama, and what I thought was fascinating, that, the first point, after death, you seem to be able to perceive, to have clear conscience, and to have perceptions. You have no eyes, you have no bodies, you have no brain to memorize, but you can see clearly, you can think clearly, you can perceive clearly, but this life panorama I thought was so fascinating, because he told me you could like rewind and fast forward and stop and slow down, and even to the point that you feel every important and non-important, or in this life you would not call them important, memories or thoughts or emotions, and seen from the other side, afflicted to it. That's so interesting.
Yes, indeed, John, and even more amazing, I've talked with numerous people who were there at the bedside of loved ones who actually did die. And when the person in the bed died, the bystanders in these cases felt that they empathically co-lived the panoramic life review of the person who died. For example, some years ago in Georgia, I met an elderly woman who had been married to her husband for many decades, as I recall. And she said that as he died in the hospital, this panorama of his entire life came up around them, and that she was convinced that she was seeing the same things as her husband, because they conversed about these scenes as they appeared. And she saw his entire life, including, of course, the aspects of his life in which she had been involved during a long marriage, but also things that she had never known about him appeared in this panorama. And that is just very, very difficult to account for from entirely physiological principles. Something entirely different and very important is going on here.
And I think this is exactly what the Bill Tiller said, even in this program, about this form of information entanglement, this coupling which goes on. So you have these holographic layers all connected. So they're already connected in a portal. We are as living human beings, but we need to attune to something or resonate with something or become coherent to have this portal entrance to these other dimensions. So I think that's fascinating. But on the other hand, if you turn that around, coherence and the coupling aspect is exactly what you're saying, like the information transfer, like a virus, but then a positive virus, gets onto the other person who has the same experience and life panorama view. If you decouple that, we would call it dissociation. And I think that's fascinating also, because as a neuropsychologist, my study to get my diploma, so to speak, was a very fascinating study with people and a very rare psychiatric condition, as they call it, dissociative identity disorder, DID. And before that, I believe they call it multiple personality disorder. It's not schizophrenia, as you of course know, but it interested me that there were cases where the dissociation went so far that even a person who was driving with glasses just got into a car accident because she transformed back, so to speak, in a different alter, which was 5 years, and didn't know how to drive a car. And one case, I even found out personally doing the research as a research, how do you call it, the leader of the practical research. I saw a person actually change, and I thought, well, even a good actor like Sean Penn or whatever can't accomplish this feat, because I saw the neck of the person change, the whole attitude and the body change, and it became a male personality while the woman was a female. And another time, which I think this story you really need to hear, was fascinating. This person told me something like, "You have it too, huh?" Something like that. I don't know, have a clue what she meant. Maybe she meant DID. Well, then I'm doing well in life, I think. But I think she meant something else, I hope. But this person also told me, "John, watch out, because if I'm in the vicinity, in the neighborhood of electronic equipment, things go wrong." And I was a critical scientist back there, and knowing for sure that vaccines are safe and effective, and consciousness is a byproduct of the brain. So I thought, yeah, right. And the crazy thing happened that actually all the software went awire, and the machine stopped, and the sounds on the headphones went to 10 unexpectedly. And she smiled at me, and she said nothing, but she said, I could telepathically feel that she said, "Yeah, right. Well, here it is. Here's your proof." But that was amazing, because this woman, when that went wrong because of a keyword, which was a trigger for other personality to come up. One time it went so wrong with another person, by the way, that, and of course we had psychiatrist Onno van der Hart present there. Maybe you know him, dissociation expert, and he asked in a professional way to let this alter go back to its state and to let the alter come back. So he handled the situation very professionally. But what's interesting, I looked in this woman's eyes, she was like 35 or something, and I saw a little child. And the crazy thing is, I saw her blinking with her eyes. She needed to drop the glasses off her head. She looked at her fingers like, what the... And she saw that there were electrodermal kind of measurement equipment and blood pressure equipment, and there was even a cardiovascular measurement equipment on her chest. But on her fingers, she saw this blood pressure thing and these electrodermal wires, and she was like, "What is this?" So I saw that she could actually not believe where she was and who these people were. So that was fascinating, because that reminds me of a near-death experience. In a way, the dissociation aspect of it.
Yes, I, like you said it reminds you, and like you, I am rather unsure about what the exact relationship between disassociation and out-of-body experiences is. And like you, John, have had a dramatic experience of a patient that I had that showed me clearly that these multiple personality cases do happen. I was a forensic psychiatrist in the United States, and I worked in a maximum security unit with paranoid schizophrenic killers and mass murderers and so on, and which we have, as you know, many more of these in America than you do in Europe. Yeah. But I had a man who had been involved in a shooting for whom, believe me, the only explanation possible was that this man had a multiple personality disorder, and I actually saw him before my eyes transform very convincingly from a man in his mid-20s to a frightened 7-year-old boy. And so once you see this with a patient, and especially in the circumstances that in which I was dealing with this patient, it's been clear to me ever since that there are certainly these cases of multiple personality disorder.
Yeah, well, if you see it, and I can hear you've experienced that firsthand, like I did. You know, there's no faking that. There's no acting. It's as real as it gets. All the emotions, all the actions, all the looking that she had to put off the glasses. And there's even one case, not in my research, but in literature, one case, and I thought that was fascinating for healing and for our self-healing capacities without ever needing drugs from now on. Was that one person, when she was in her main alter state, her head state, let's put it this way, the central personality state, she was allergic to heroin, I believe it was.
Yes.
You know the story, okay.
I know of similar cases that a person who's allergic to one thing, when they have one personality, may be exposed to that same substance when they're another personality, and yet they're not allergic to it.
Well, and even addicted to it, yes.
Yes, and I've also heard the same thing in some cases with diabetes, that one personality may have diabetes, and yet another personality shows no laboratory signs of it.
But that says something very important, how we regard disease and health, because how can you be allergic or sick from some substance in one personality state and in another alternate consciousness state, because that's how I see it. You can even dissociate yourself through meditation. I mean, we can do it consciously, so to speak. We don't have to be patients for that, luckily. But then we can be not allergic to a substance. So I think that reflects our self-healing capacities, which we can actually do through attunement with consciousness. And one question which pops up in my mind, I didn't write it down, but I think it's important to ask. It comes up in my mind while thinking about this and having the discussion with you. Are there any, I don't know if there are, but I imagine there are there any NDE experiencers who come back to life and always had this allergy or always had this illness or always had these addicting thought forms or whatever kind of patterns in life, not just how they view life or want to live their life, but also the bodily functions and their health and their illnesses. Have these changed dramatically after returning to life?
Actually, Bill, as you know, having talked with thousands of people now, there may be such cases, and I just don't remember them, but I can't bring to my mind anyway any cases that had that particular feature. So again, I just don't know.
Okay, well, it could be that there's a completely different person, like the partners who sometimes depart with their partner because they're not the same person anymore. That was my question. So maybe they have different symptoms or a different kind of response, because it reminded me to one part of our research with the people with dissociative identity disorder, DID, was a memory task where actually it was fascinating. We did conscious memory task and implicit memory, which is more unconscious. So here we go again to this unconscious territory, this multidimensional world. We did a memory test, and they said, of course, and even got a little bit angry because they said, yeah, you're asking Raymond to remember 15 words, and now you're asking John to call these 15 words. What a nice test. Are you joking with me? So they got angry about that because they don't know, of course. But then the interesting part is, when we did the implicit memory test, there was some information transfer, statistically significant, that the other alter did indeed receive unconsciously the information. And that's, of course, the same person, but it's the same kind of energetic information transfer on an unconscious level, which I think happens to people just in general life on an intuitive level and ESP kind of things. I think that's all connected.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have to tell you, I think we are now. I want to give you the chance or the choice, actually, to decide if you want to go on. I think I have more questions I asked myself during this interview than I put down even, and that was a lot. So I want to mention your books, Vorige Levens, which is Life Before Life, and Over de Grens van Leven en Dood, which is Reunions, and The Tunnel en het Licht, The Light Beyond, but most importantly your new one, which is available now through Stranghold publisher, yes, my old music publisher, and that's Leven na dit leven, Life After Life. And you also have the workshops which you are going to give here in Holland through, what was the website again?
It's www.fifthdimension, and it's there in Holland. And
.nl, .nl, I think, yes.
Yes.
Yes, .nl, okay. Yeah.
And it is, I'll be coming in April, and I will be doing a series of 2-day workshops for 12 people at a time, in which we actually go through a process in which it imparts an entirely new logic and opens up an important, forgotten channel of the mind, which has many positive effects on our cognitive structure, and also leads to a unique new method of investigating near-death experiences and other phenomena related to life after death. So I'm just very, very happy to be coming to Holland this spring to spend some time there.
Well, I'm happy too, because I wonder if I could be the 12th or the 13th person. Actually, if you like, I would like to cover maybe the workshops or do an interview live over there, and maybe even focus on a separate broadcast in April. But you can let me know later if that's
wonderful,
if that's okay.
John. I can let you know now. I would love to do that.
It's a yes. Okay.
I would love to do it. That's wonderful.
Okay.
I always loved to come to Holland. The first time I came was in the summer of 1969. So it's one of my favorite places to visit.
And I think it's one of your favorite jokes, because you told the audience, and I had to laugh too, because I was born in 1968. So, and you said, well, when I visited you, I think most of you were not even born. So
that's right.
So, okay. Well, let me thank you, Mr. Moody, for a very great conversation, interview, discussion, experience, whatever we might want to call it. I think the information which came through was amazing on a personal level, spiritual level, and scientific level. And I think a lot of information came through actually showing that we can trust and have the willingness to believe that it's about the soul and about love and loving relationships, and that we get the lessons when we cross over to the other side. So I want to thank you for your amazing work, and for your time and for your extra time, because we're not there the first hour, and we made up for the loss of the first hour. So I'm very happy for that. Okay.
Oh, thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you again and being with you in April.
Okay, well, we'll be in touch. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
To all the listeners, we are now closing down this radio program, and I have to be humble here and be very proud that Raymond has now also left us, not as in this world, but in this conversation through telephone, through America. Bill Teller was gone earlier, but you can listen to the radio program probably tonight, maybe tomorrow. I want to thank you all. My website is www.healingsoundmovement.com. Thank you and hear you next time. Bye-bye.